Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Toby Talks. I'm your host, Toby Hoy, and I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to dive into something that every single one of us has to do, whether we're leading a team of 100 people or just trying to help a colleague improve. We're talking about giving feedback that actually influences behavior. Now, as usual, I know what you're thinking already. Feedback? Really? Haven't we beaten this topic to death? But here's the thing. If we'd actually figured this out, we wouldn't still be having the same frustrating experiences over and over and over again. Now, I know you know what I mean. You sit down with someone, you carefully deliver what you think is constructive feedback, and then weeks later, nothing has changed. The same behaviors, the same problems, the same issues, the same frustration. So today we're going to completely rethink how we approach feedback. And I'm going to share some frameworks and some strategies that have worked for both the leaders that I've coached or mentored over the years and for me personally. This isn't theory. This is practical stuff that you can use in your next feedback conversation, whether that's tomorrow or this afternoon. So let's dive in. All right, so let me start with a story. Early in my career, I had a team member, we'll just call him Jake, who was incredibly talented, but he had this habit of dominating meetings. He would talk over people, he would shoot down ideas before they were fully formed, and generally create an environment where other team members just stopped contributing. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I called him into my office and told him what I had observed, explained why it was a problem, and asked him to be more mindful of others in meetings. He nodded, seemed to understand, and I walked out of that conversation feeling pretty good about myself. I thought that I had handled it, except nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. And I could not figure out why. I had given him clear feedback. I'd been direct but respectful. What was the problem? Here's what I had eventually learned. I treated feedback like it was a download. My job was to transfer information from my brain into his, and his job was to receive it and change it. But that's not how human beings work. We're not computers. You can't just install an update and expect a different behavior. What I didn't understand at the time was that effective feedback requires creating the conditions for someone to actually hear you, internalize your message, and then choose to change. And that is a completely different skill set. So let's talk about those conditions. The first one, and this is absolutely foundational, is psychological safety. As a side note, if you've listened to or read any of my prior content, you know that we talk about this one a ton because it is simply that important. You may have even heard about this term used in leadership circles, but what does it actually mean in practice? Psychological safety is the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up, asking questions, or making mistakes. And here's why this matters for feedback. When people don't feel safe or they feel threatened, their brains internally change how they process information. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and behavior change, goes offline. And the amygdala, which handles the fight or flight or freeze responses, takes over. So think about what this means. If someone feels threatened by your feedback, it doesn't matter how. This is where most feedback fails before it even starts. We dive right into the conversation without establishing that we're on the same team and working toward the same goals. So how do you build psychological safety? Well, it's not something that you can manufacture in the moment. It's built over time through consistent actions. But one of the most powerful things you can do is to share your own failures openly. When I started being more transparent about my own mistakes and what I was learning from them, I noticed a huge shift on the people from my team. Folks became more willing to admit when they didn't know something, more willing to try new approaches, even if they might fail, and more receptive to feedback when I offered it. All of that is because I signaled that growth was valued more than perfection, and that changes everything. Now, once you have that foundation of psychological safety, the next critical shift is moving from judgment to observation. And here's what I mean by that. Most feedback is loaded with judgments. Things like, you're not detail oriented, you're not a team player, or you need to be more proactive. Those are interpretations. They're the conclusions that you've drawn. And the problem with judgments is that they're abstract, they're debatable, and they immediately trigger defensiveness. Compare that to observations, which are just facts. Things like, in the last three reports you submitted, there were calculation errors in the summary tables. Or in yesterday's meeting, you interrupted Sarah three times and didn't acknowledge the concerns that she raised. Or the project deadline was Friday and the deliverable came in on Monday. You see the difference there? Observations are specific, factual, and much harder to dispute. They give someone clear data about the behavior without attaching meaning or character judgments to it. And here's the thing, when you lead with observations, you're actually showing respect for the other person's intelligence and autonomy. You're giving them the data and trusting them to draw their own conclusions and develop their own solutions. This one is hard for many leaders because we think our job is to have all the answers. We think we need to tell people what to change and how to change it. But that undermines the very thing that we're trying to create, which is ownership of the change. And that brings me to the next principle. And this one completely transformed how I approached feedback conversations. Instead of telling people what to change, I started getting curious about what was driving their behavior. Let me give you an example. I had a team member who kept missing deadlines. My initial instinct was to discuss time management and prioritization. But instead, I started with curiosity. I started the conversation with, hey, I noticed the last three project deadlines have been missed. Can you tell me what's getting in the way? And what I learned was fascinating. It turned out that she was being pulled into urgent requests from other departments that she didn't feel empowered to push back on. She was trying to do everything and something had to give. If I had just lectured her about meeting deadlines, I would have completely missed the real problem. And no amount of feedback about time management or prioritization would have fixed it because time management wasn't the issue. This is why curiosity is so powerful. When you approach feedback with genuine questions instead of conclusions, you often discover that what you're seeing isn't the real problem. It's a symptom of something else. And when you understand the root cause, you can address it rather than treating the symptom repeatedly. Plus, and this is huge, when someone feels heard and understood, they're exponentially more open to feedback because you've demonstrated that you're trying to help, not to just judge. So let's talk about structure for a minute. Even with the right mindset, it helps to have a framework for actually having these conversations. So here's what I do. I start by sharing my observation, just the facts, no interpretation. Something like, I noticed in the last team meeting that you didn't contribute any ideas during the brainstorming session. Then get curious. I'm wondering what is going on for you in that meeting. Can you help me understand? And then listen, really listening, not formatting a response. I'm not waiting for my turn to talk. I'm generally trying to understand their perspective. Once I've heard their side, I'll work to create a shared understanding. This is where I'll reflect back. what I've heard to make sure that we're on the same page. Something along the lines of, so what I'm hearing is that you feel like the direction had already been decided and you didn't think your input would make a difference. Is that right? This confirmation is important because it ensures that you're both looking at the same thing and agreeing on what you see. Without the shared understanding, you're having two different conversations in the same room. Once we're aligned on the current situation, I can help them see the impact. And this is where you connect their behavior to the outcomes that they care about. Something like, I want you to know that your perspective is really valuable to me and to the team. When you don't share your ideas, we can miss out on insights that could strengthen our work. And I worry that over time, you might start to feel disconnected from the projects that you're not shaping. Notice the language there. I'm not saying you're hurting the team or you're being a bad teammate. I'm showing them the impact and assuming that they care about the outcome. Now, here's where most feedback conversations go wrong. After establishing the problem and the impact, we jump straight into telling people what to do. Things like, you need to speak up more in meetings, or you need to manage your time better, or you need to be more detail oriented. But here's the problem with this approach. When you tell someone what to do, you might get compliance, but you won't get commitment. And compliance is temporary. Commitment is what drives lasting behavior change. So instead of telling them what to do, I'll ask them what they think should happen differently. Something like, what do you think would help you feel more comfortable sharing ideas in meetings? Or what are some options that you see for handling the situation differently going forward? This question shifts everything. It moves the person from a passive recipient of feedback to an active participant in solving the problem. And people are way more committed to their own ideas than they are to yours. Sometimes they'll come up with solutions that you'd have never thought of. Sometimes they'll identify barriers that you didn't know existed. And sometimes they'll need help brainstorming, and that's okay too. You can offer suggestions, but make sure that they're the ones who choose the path to go forward. Now, once you've got agreement on what's going to change, you need to be specific and make it measurable because vague commitments lead to vague results. If someone says, I'll try to do better, you haven't actually created the conditions for change. You need specificity. Something like, so you're committed to preparing at least one idea before each team meeting and sharing it during the brainstorming session. And if you're feeling uncertain about whether to speak up, you'll take the risk and share it anyway. Do I have that right? This level of detail does a few things. It creates clear expectations. It gives you both something concrete to track, and it removes ambiguity that could lead to future misunderstandings. And here's the next critical piece. You need to build in accountability. Feedback without follow up is just venting. If you want behavior to change, you need to agree on checkpoints to revisit the conversation. Something like, let's check in after our next 3 team meetings and see how this is going. We can adjust if needed. These checkpoints signal that you care enough to follow up. They create momentum and they provide an opportunity to celebrate progress or to course correct if things aren't working. All right, we've been talking a lot about corrective feedback, but I want to spend some time on positive feedback because it's just as important for influencing behavior. Research shows that high performing teams have roughly a 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions than to corrective interactions. 5-to-1. Think about that. But here's the thing. Positive feedback has to be specific to actually influence future behavior. Good job is nice, but it doesn't tell somebody what to keep doing. It doesn't reinforce specific behaviors. Compare good job to this. The way you handled that difficult client conversation was impressive. you stayed calm, you acknowledged their frustrations, and you offered three concrete solutions. That is exactly the kind of problem solving approach that we need. Do you see the difference? This kind of feedback gives someone a clear picture of what success looks like. It reinforces their strength and it builds the trust and the goodwill that makes corrective feedback easier to receive if and when it's needed. I try to make it a habit to catch people doing things right and then acknowledge it specifically, not just to make them feel good, though that's a nice side benefit, but it actually shapes behavior in the direction that I want to see. So let me bring this all together with a simple framework that you can use for your next feedback conversation. Number one is before the conversation, gather specific observations. Get curious about what might be driving a specific behavior. Check your own assumptions and judgments at the door. When opening the conversation, share your observation. Express genuine curiosity about their perspective and listen more than you talk. During the conversation, seek shared understanding of the situation and its impact. Ask them what they think should happen differently, and then help them get specific about commitments. To close out the conversation, confirm the agreement and set a follow up time. Express confidence in their ability to make the change. After the conversation, follow up as promised. Notice and acknowledge progress and adjust the approach if it's not working. Now, this framework may be simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. It requires patience, it requires practice, and it requires a genuine commitment to helping others grow rather than just correcting their behavior. Let me circle back to the story at the beginning, the one about Jake, the guy who dominated meetings. You want to know how that story ended? Eventually, I had another conversation with him, but this time I approached it completely differently. Instead of telling him that what he was doing wrong, I got curious. I started with, hey, I've noticed that you're often the first person to respond in meetings and you have a lot of strong opinions. So help me understand what's driving that. What he told me next surprised me. He said that he felt like if he didn't speak up immediately, the team would make poor decisions. He was actually trying to protect the team from mistakes. In his mind, he was being helpful. Once I understood that, we could have a real conversation. I helped him see that while his intentions were good, the impact was that other folks stopped sharing ideas. And we brainstormed together about how he could still contribute his expertise while creating a little more space for everyone else. He came up with the idea of being the last person to speak in brainstorming sessions, unless someone specifically asked for his input. And it worked. Meetings were completely transformed. Other team members started contributing more, and Jake became one of the team's strongest mentors because he learned to use his expertise to draw others out rather than to dominate the conversation. But that change only happened because I stopped trying to tell him what to do and started trying to understand what was driving his behavior. That shift made all the difference. Here's what I want you to take away from this episode. Giving feedback that influences behavior isn't a technique, it's a practice. It's something that you get better at over time through repetition, reflection, and refinement. You're going to have conversations that don't go well. You're going to say the wrong thing sometimes. You're going to miss opportunities or come across harsher than you may have intended. That's part of the learning process. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is progress. And over time, as you build these skills, observation without judgment, curiosity without assumption, clarity without control, and accountability without micromanagement, something remarkable happens. Feedback stops being this dreaded event and becomes a natural part of how you interact with your team. People start seeking it out rather than avoiding it. And behavior actually changes. not because you forced it, but because you created the conditions that made the change possible. All right, that's what I got for you today. I'd love to hear about your experiences with feedback. What's worked for you? What hasn't? What's your biggest challenge? You can reach me on all the social platforms. Just search for Toby Talks or drop a comment in the YouTube version of this episode. As always, if you found this helpful, please share it with someone who might benefit. Word of mouth is how this show grows, and I'd really appreciate you helping spread the message. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep having those conversations that matter. This is Toby Hoy, and you've been listening to Toby Talks.